Well, hello everyone, Dr. David Perlmutter here. We're all interested in living a long and a healthy life. We want to have a good lifespan and we want to be as healthy as we can during the time that we remain alive. And there's so much research that is going on these days looking at both our longevity and our health span as well. We know that the foods that we eat, or the foods that we avoid for that matter, have a significant role to play in changing various pathways, biochemical pathways in our bodies that have a role to play in our ability to rid ourselves, for example, of defective cells, in limiting the growth of things that may turn cancerous, etc. There's a lot of research being done looking at the so-called Sirtuin pathway. Many of you have heard of that. And more recently, we're hearing a lot more about some of the upstream pathways that relate to the Sirtuin pathway. Things like IGF-1 and the mTOR pathway. And these are the pathways that we're going to explore in today's program with our guest, James Clement. James Clement is the author of this new book called The Switch, which I had the opportunity to review an advanced copy of and found it to be very, very interesting. It's certainly an area that we've been looking at quite aggressively because it is a metabolic, biochemical switch in the body that has significant implications in terms of the balance between building up and breaking down. We tend to focus on building up, getting bigger muscles, becoming bigger and stronger, etc. But the process of autophagy, of breaking down things that are defective within our cells, for example, is actually extremely important as it relates to longevity in everything from yeast to roundworms to rodents, primates, and humans. So we need to look at that. And so what we will do on our program today is explore this switch. The title of the book, The Switch, we'll explore the switch that really is the switch between building up and breaking down. I'll tell you a little bit more about the author. James Clement is a lawyer and entrepreneur turned research scientist who's devoted the past 2 decades to understanding the basic science of life extension. He is best known for his work in what is called the supercentenarian research study, which he started in 2010 with Professor George Church at Harvard Medical School. He's had worldwide collaborations in his laboratory, which is in Gainesville, Florida, where he focuses on advancing cutting-edge biomedical discoveries so that we can all learn and perhaps even take advantage of these breakthrough discoveries that he is making in his laboratory. So let's just jump right into our interview today.
David, it's great to be speaking with you.
So we are going to learn today what the switch is all about. And as I mentioned in the at the introduction, there's a lot of talk these days about how we can really affect some important metabolic processes in our bodies that may have an important role in terms of disease resistance and even longevity. So first of all, define for us what the switch is, and then I'd like to take a step back and ask you in particular, how did you get to that spot?
Sure. So the switch I refer to is a metabolic switch that's inside our cells called mTOR, and it basically switches the cell's focus from either growth to repair. And unfortunately, in modern civilization, from about the mid-1800s on, it's almost always in the growth state and never in the repair. And so the book is really about learning about the switch and how to at least periodically turn on the repair mechanisms.
And for our viewers, this is very, very important information because I think, we live in a time when for the past 3 years, life expectancy in America has gone down, that we're being crippled worldwide by chronic degenerative conditions. And we're sort of living under this misguided idea that the more we eat, the more protein especially, the better for us. And, we're going to now explore this switching mechanism and how we control it and how we can basically turn it off. I mean, don't we all think that it's best to be in growth mode all the time?
Certainly, you do want to be in growth mode periodically because that's what replaces our muscle cells, our neurons, our stem cells, regenerates our immune system, etc. But if you keep that on all the time, proliferation or cell proliferation is also what we call cancer. And diabetes, heart disease, and Alzheimer's are all linked to this switch being turned on full time and autophagy, the repair mechanism, being turned off.
So this is a very important term. It's called autophagy, auto, self, phagy, eating. And it's basically the way that cells are able to rid themselves of debris, of organelles, for example, that are defective. It's a very important process, basically allowing our bodies to not necessarily take out the garbage, but to recycle. And why would we have such a mechanism in place?
Well, billions of years ago, bacteria had to adapt to times of feast and times of famine. And the ones that learned to cope with the famine, that is deprivation of nutrients being available, those cells that could hunker down and survive were the ones that we evolved from. So all plants and organisms that we know about have this same cellular mechanism in them called TOR in bacteria and mTOR in the rest of us. And this process that helped them survive basically broke down misfolded proteins and dysfunctional organelles like mitochondria that weren't working properly inside the cell and provided them with nutrients, in this case amino acids from those proteins and organelles that the cell could use to keep functioning. But it had this added benefit for long-lived species that it got rid of things that would essentially jam up the works, these misfolded proteins and free radical producing mitochondria.
So I want to just make sure that we keep our audience really in a place of grasping what we are talking about, and more importantly, why this is really very valuable information. Uh, let's talk about how this whole pathway relates to illness, relates to longevity. Let's extrapolate from yeast and from C. elegans and all the way up to mammals and humans. Talk to us about why this really matters.
Well, we know that most neurological age-related illnesses are actually protein folding problems. And this ranges from Huntington's to Alzheimer's. And we also know that protein folding is involved in cardiovascular disease with atherosclerosis and certainly in diabetes as well. So it turns out you can look at hunter-gatherer groups and peoples around the world currently living, which I talk about in the book, the Okinawans, the Loma Linda vegans, monks in Mount Athos, Greece, that all live non-traditional Western diet lifestyles. So they practice fasting or calorie restriction or other ways that are not the typical way Americans and Northern Europeans eat, that limit the mTOR being turned on and keep autophagy turned up much more. And you see that these groups of people, in fact, do not have cancer and diabetes or neurological diseases at the same rate as normal people.
So you've discovered something I think that's really very important, that there is a relationship between perhaps some of these lifestyle choices of these groups, some of them being included in the blue zones, and it relates to two things that you mentioned, you believe, calorie restriction and occasional fasting, that tends to activate this pathway that you're talking about, that mTOR pathway, that then enhances this process of autophagy to clear out cellular debris. Now let's go upstream just a little bit before mTOR, at least biochemically, and explore something related to insulin, which is IGF-1. Let's talk about how that relates to this whole pathway, its activation or its suppression.
Right. Well, there's been a tremendous amount of research, scientific research on the IGF-1 pathway. It's been looked at in calorie restricted animals. So Clive McKay at Cornell was doing research on calorie restricted rats, I believe, back in 1935. And later, Stephen Spindler at UC Riverside did tremendous amounts of research on calorie restricted animals. And one of the things that he interestingly found was that if you restricted calories but kept the protein levels up, that you didn't get the benefits of calorie restriction. And they traced this to the IGF-1 pathway. And this pathway is one of several sensors that essentially feed into this mTOR complex and tell it whether it should be in growth mode or recycling mode. And if you essentially limit the IGF-1 levels, which could be insulin levels, so we have both IGF-1 in our bloodstream, but also insulin, and both of them act on this particular receptor. So high blood sugar equals high insulin levels, which turns on this particular switch, so to speak, and tells mTOR to be in the growth stage. So does oxygen. So intermittent hypoxia, which I talk about, several long-lived species undergo intermittent hypoxia on a regular basis. Naked mole rats, which are sort of long-lived rodents, and then bowhead whales, which are mammals like us, but they can live over 200 years. So there's examples in nature of organisms that have limited IGF-1 and have extraordinarily longer lives and better health than their counterparts.
Well, and there are examples in humans as well. I mean, can we explore a little bit the work by Laron in Israel and how that information allowed you to clarify your understanding of this pathway?
Certainly. So there was a group of people that were brought to him to study essentially their endocrinology and to help them. They were born as dwarfs. So the men average around 4 feet and the women slightly smaller. And they were traced back to a family in Spain when Spain was Moorish. And half of that group went off to the Middle East and Israel, and the other half went to South America. So there's two populations of individuals that have these genetic propensity towards this particular kind of dwarfism that's named after the person that discovered it, Laron. So it's called Laron syndrome, but it's a receptor problem that limits their ability, in their case, to process IGF-1 in the liver. It's an autosomal recessive trait, which, as you know, means that both parents have to be carriers. If both parents are carriers, then about 50% of the children will have inherited both genes and will be dwarfs. But the interesting thing is that they're protected from diabetes and cancer. So there's only one recorded history of someone having a tumor among a group of about 300 to 400 of them alive at any time since the Middle Ages. They also have much lower incidences of neurological disease. This is another example where by limiting IGF-1, they're basically impervious to cancer, and they're also protected from cancer. diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's, etc. But obviously, we don't want this particular loss of function mutation in ourselves and all be dwarfs, but we can, through diet, limit the amount of IGF-1 that our body produces.
So we want to limit the amount of IGF-1. It's part of the insulin pathway because of the role that IGF-1 plays in signaling mTOR. And I want to come back to that in just a moment in terms of those dietary strategies that you talk about. But this seems to segue quite nicely to the work of researchers like Dr. David Sinclair at Harvard that are evaluating the other pathways looking at related to aging. And so I wonder if you could just talk about his work with reference to the sirtuins and how that seems quite connected to what we're talking about.
That's absolutely correct. Lenny Garanti at MIT, where David was a postdoc, and now David is a genetics professor at Harvard Medical School. They both have done a lot of research on sirtuins, which in particular are turned on in calorie restriction. So they are part of the downstream mechanism that when mTOR is turned down, sirtuins are turned up. And David in particular started a company to create compounds that would help turn up sirtuins all the time, and found that they were very, very beneficial to rodents with diabetes and help protect them, as well as lengthen their lifespan. The trouble is that, again, in our Western diet, when we eat lots of amino acids that specifically are made to turn on mTOR, and this is primarily from breast milk. So, of course, young animals want to grow as fast as possible, especially calves. So, they need to be able to run and keep up with the herd, stay away from predators. So, cow's milk has a lot of the amino acids that turn on mTOR and really spur growth. In fact, 4 times more leucine than human breast milk. So when humans now drink dairy products or eat cheese, they're getting really high concentrations of this protein that's meant to help calves grow as quickly as possible and put on as much weight as possible. And that's not something that we want going on in us.
So when we talk about milk, it might be more than just the casein that people may react to, the lactose sugar, but you're talking about the amino acid array in the proteins in milk that may actually have an effect on mTOR, spurring growth and keeping us from activating autophagy, and that might have a role to play in reducing lifespan and making us more susceptible to degenerative conditions, cancer, things like that, diabetes, and even misfolded protein issues like Alzheimer's and perhaps Parkinson's.
That's exactly right.
There are some mimetics, if you will, of caloric restriction that have been talked about that can work through this pathway as well and help stimulate the sirtuins. Do you talk about that much either in the book? I don't recall reading about things like resveratrol, but what are your thoughts on those so-called caloric restriction mimetics?
So all of these compounds, and there's numerous ones, I think I mentioned 20 or 30 of them. They're also known as anti-tumorigenic compounds. So it means that it reduces the likelihood of tumors being formed. And they all work by suppressing mTOR and turning up autophagy. So whether it's ECGC, glucosamine, even aspirin, all to some extent suppress mTOR and turn up autophagy. And that's the part of calorie restriction that they are in fact mimicking, and what provides the benefits from taking these kind of supplements. So I do go over that. And if you want to balance this anabolic state where you're undergoing growth With the catabolic state where you're doing repair, you want to take those supplements only during the catabolic repair period. If you're trying to build muscle, and if you think about it, branched chain amino acids, which are basically the ones you would get from whey protein, from milk, that's what bodybuilders use to grow muscles and really become strong. That is contrary to taking these kind of calorie mimic drugs. So when you're in this anabolic state, you really just want mTOR to be turned on, and that's the period when you want to be doing like weightlifting and endurance exercises and things to really put on muscle and also put on a little weight. And then at the other times, you want to fast, reduce your protein intake, do calorie restriction. And I talk about there's different ways to accomplish this. Ketogenic diets, eating like a Loma Linda vegan, for example, with very low fish or meat or dairy intake, and accomplishing this inhibition of mTOR.
So it's you described basically in the book how to eat, and it looked overall like it seemed to be a bit protein restricted, at least in terms of what people are commonly eating or used to eating. And I think that seems to be a trend these days in terms of this whole notion of activation of autophagy. Nonetheless, suddenly we're seeing this carnivorous diet appearing, where there's virtually no dietary fiber and very little vegetables, almost zero carbohydrate, and yet a lot of protein. And based on what you're telling us today, that may not seem to be an appropriate diet if we want to live long and be disease resistant.
Well, what we don't find is any of these groups, hunter-gatherers or Loma Linda, vegans, Okinawans, monks, etc. We don't find any groups living that are high meat, high dairy consumers that are long-lived. So that's a concern to me. You could limit your carbohydrates and reduce your insulin levels, and technically, I think you could get into ketogenesis by doing that. But your liver will actually make glucose from protein. So if you don't deplete your glycogen stores, and you need to deplete those in order for mTOR to go into this catabolic state, then being on a carnivore diet really won't mimic all of these calorie restriction-like benefits that you get from these various diets, whether it's ketogenic or intermittent fasting or actual calorie restriction.
So the switch that you identified, in fact, the title of your book, The Switch, is really a way of our bodies adapting to feast versus famine, as opposed to the 24/7 bombardment with calories and especially amino acids and carbs that we're seeing today. It was the idea that when we didn't have a source of calories during the periods of food scarcity, that our bodies would respond in a positive way to that low-level stress, we call that hormesis, to allow us to endure.
That's absolutely correct. And even the invention of breakfast is relatively novel in human history. So it actually, the English terminology is to break fast, because when you stop eating in the evening, and again, don't forget that people went to bed much earlier than people do now. So only until the 1800s were people staying up too long after dark. But they had long overnight fasts, and then they would eat their first big meal of the day around 11, 12 o'clock. And then they would eat a small dinner, followed by, a long overnight fast. We're completely away from that in today's culture, where people literally have ice cream and popcorn and things like that right up till bedtime. And then as soon as they wake up, grab a bite to eat, and it could be a bagel or a donut or cereal, and all of those things are high glycemic, so they instantly turn off autophagy and turn back up cell growth. And I think
No, I'm
one
just
of the
going to
things,
ask the question. You were
right,
talking a moment ago about the branched chain amino acids, leucine, isoleucine, and valine. The fact that dairy products, for example, contain branched chain amino acids. Is this a quantity kind of an issue whereby even small amounts found in the creamer in your coffee, for example, first thing in the morning, can actually lead to changes in IGF-1 expression and therefore affect mTOR?
it absolutely does. So interestingly enough, I sent my book to some researchers that I've known a really long time. One of them had been trying to diet for a year or more and wasn't being very successful. And he said, I read your book and I stopped putting coffee, cream in my coffee in the morning. And he said, within a week, I started losing weight. And actually, one of my publishers, hearing that story, did the same thing and had the exact same results. So even a small amount of dairy will essentially just like wedge the accelerator on this mTOR molecule and keep it in the anabolic state, regardless of what else we try and do.
So again, it sounds like we're looking at then a balance between an anabolic activity and catabolic activity, meaning building up and breaking down. It sort of sounds like the bird song, "Turn, turn, turn." To every day there is a season, time to build up, a time to break down. In our modern world, everyone's wanting to build up and thinking that that's the ticket. But I'd like to walk through what are some of your considerations, and I know we've touched on this earlier, but what are some of the downsides of always building up?
Well, certainly increased cancer risk is noticed in every organism that has mTOR turned on. And in longer lived organisms, you don't see any clearing out of these dysfunctional mitochondria or these misfolded proteins. And so you get numerous health problems from that, including the cardiovascular disease and cognitive impairment, including Alzheimer's.
So, just for our viewers, the notion of wanting to clear out defective mitochondria, I think, is really very important. We recognize primarily that Alzheimer's, as an example, is an acquired mitochondropathy or an acquired dysfunction, problematic function of the mitochondria. When the mitochondria are working inefficiently and we propagate these defective mitochondria because we haven't cleared them out, ultimately the energy balance within that neuron, comparing the energy level, looking at what's called the transmembrane potential. In other words, the electrical voltage between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell is changed, and that ultimately activates certain pathways called the caspase pathways that turn on a process called apoptosis. That sounds very complicated, but what I'm saying is defective mitochondria leads to pre-programmed cell death. And as it relates to your brain cells, might not necessarily be something we want to do. So to get back to our discussion, we really want to do what we can to keep our mitochondria, our energy producers, healthy and help our bodies rid themselves, our cells rid themselves of those defective mitochondria, because if they are defective, they may still propagate, they may still reproduce, and ultimately
Absolutely.
we begin to grow mitochondria that are not as effective in producing energy, and that can lead to pre-programmed cell death.
Yeah.
So where do we stand in the world of being able to influence this pathway well beyond just what your lifestyle recommendations are telling us, and even supplements? I mean, is there a pharmaceutical angle here that people are looking at in terms of jumping in on this pathway? I know, rapamycin, where this was originally identified, is something that is used for to keep people from, for example, rejecting transplant organs, etc. But are there other ways that we can target these receptors to turn down mTOR that might be valuable for us?
There's a lot of research being done on rapamycin itself. I think there's over 2,000 clinical trials, mostly involving how to use rapamycin to inhibit cancer. So by stopping mTOR at the right stage, then you can keep these cells from proliferating. Um, uh, on the other hand, there's companies that are producing molecules that are similar to rapamycin that they want to turn on only one of the two mTOR complexes. So one of the complexes called mTORC1 is more associated with the benefits, and mTORC2 is associated with the autoimmune response that protects transplant patients, but it also upregulates autoimmunity. So it can suppress your immune system and cause you to essentially get arthritis and other issues as well. Mm-hmm. But metformin, berberine as a natural compound, these drugs all affect energy production inside the cell, reduce ATP, and cause something called AMPK to be turned on. That molecule is upstream of mTOR and also regulates mTOR. So if you suppress your energy levels, which you can also do through high exertion of exercise, so that's another way of turning autophagy on, is just doing a lot more intense exercise, especially without drinking Gatorade and replenishing your glycogen stores. So if you can burn through your glucose with exercise, you can also turn off mTOR, just like these pharmaceutical and nutraceutical compounds.
Well, let's talk about metformin for just a moment, because you brought it up. I mean, this is probably remains the most commonly prescribed medication for type 2 diabetics. And you did mention a couple of ideas in terms of how it works mechanistically, AMP kinase, and also through energy inhibition, specifically by inhibition of complex 1 as it relates to mitochondrial function. And that might serve then to have a downstream effect in terms of helping regulate mTOR activity. Right. I recently attended a longevity event, and I was surprised to learn that about half of the research scientists in the room were actually non-diabetic, were taking metformin, had bought into this notion that this was a really handy way of really amplifying what you are talking about in your book, The Switch. And, we like to say above all, do no harm, and look at what's called risk-benefit ratio. There was a study published in the New England Journal of Medicine several years ago that looked at giving pre-diabetics either lifestyle change, dietary change, and exercise versus metformin, and looked at the conversion rate to becoming full-blown diabetic. And they found that actually there was a slight advantage to those who got the lifestyle recommendations or were in that group in terms of their reduced risk for becoming diabetic versus the metformin group. But the mortality was twice as high in the group receiving the metformin versus the lifestyle change. So, recalling that study as I was chatting with these individuals who were all in on taking metformin, made me wonder if, in fact, that is necessarily the way we want to go. These systems work with all kinds of checks and balances. And when you flood one part of this system overwhelmingly, like you do with metformin, for example, we wonder if that is just too aggressive of a modulation of these pathways. There is a push these days to look at another part of this whole scheme, and that is through affecting NAD+, using nicotinamide riboside or nicotinamide mononucleotide, because that is certainly playing into the energy part of this equation as well. And again, getting back to Dr. David Sinclair, looking at the effects of both nicotinamide riboside, nicotinamide mononucleotide in being able to affect this pathway and ultimately downstream effects like sirtuin. I think it's very exciting, but to me, it just seems more valuable and likely safer to approach this as you do in the switch, and that is by emulating what our ancestors must have done to survive, not knowingly, but how these pathways must have been influenced that augmented their survivability and therefore passed on their genome to you and me. And that is through periodically stressing our systems by caloric restriction. And as you just brought up, by engaging in pushing our exercise a little bit.
Absolutely. And I agree with your cautions about taking drugs that keep only one side of this switch on all the time. And I've even had conversations with some of these individuals who have been on metformin for a couple of years and are my age or older. And I've said, hey, have you noticed any muscle loss? And they said, well, yeah, I'm getting older. So, yeah, my muscles are a lot smaller than they used to be. And I was saying, like, so do you see a contradiction here that you're taking something that turns off muscle growth? Like, don't you think you should balance this a little more and turn it on periodically? And, I don't think it's really crossed their minds. They understand how valuable turning on autophagy is. There's more and more popular articles about it, and certainly tremendous amounts of scientific literature supporting it. But it's sort of like saying, I heard that fasting is really good, so I'm going to fast the rest of my life, and just starve myself to death. Like, that doesn't work. We have to understand how our human body evolved, what these mechanisms are. And one of the things I try and do in the book is to cover this broadly enough and in enough detail without overwhelming the reader that they can go away later, and if someone talks to them about a protein diet or some later fad diet, that they can use this information to analyze it and say, yeah, but this is going to turn on autophagy, or this is going to turn on mTOR at a time that I do or don't want it on. And so they'll be able to make these decisions for themselves, how to cycle back and forth and how to incorporate new information as it comes along, because this switch isn't going anywhere. It's hardwired into us and all the plants and animals on the planet. We have to abide by it.
Well, I think that you and I may have jumped in a little bit deep, and I know that our viewers might be doing a little head scratching right now. But I just want to assure everybody that the way you presented this material is really very broken down, piece by piece, very understandable. There are two major players that you talk about, and that is IGF-1 and mTOR. So if there are only two things that you really have to take away from the switch, is that this activation of IGF-1 and activation of mTOR are things that we want to reduce. Is there a time for it? Yeah, you bet there is, when we're trying to be anabolic and grow. But your point is well taken, that the extreme of anabolic activity is unbridled growth that we see representing cancer, and that there is a very important time for cleaning things out and getting rid of the defective material. So again, while we jumped into some pretty deep areas of science, the book is very, very straightforward. And beyond that, it's a real pleasure to read. I mean, I never knew about rapamycin in terms of the name coming from the Easter Islands and its discovery and being brought back, and other kinds of anecdotes that you described. So it's a very pleasurable book to read. Everybody in the podcast world, I think right now, is really kind of fixating on this notion of autophagy, and I think with very good reason. I want to just get your opinion on one last topic before we go today, and that is something that is, I think, puzzling to a lot of us who think about this kind of stuff. Not that it keeps us up at night, shouldn't, because we need to sleep, but that is the idea that we really might want to have upregulation of IGF-1 as it relates to the brain, as it relates to the whole notion of neurogenesis. So we have, on the one hand, trying to keep IGF-1 in check as it relates to the rest of the body, but on the other hand, we know that IGF-1, like BDNF, acts as a trophic hormone in the brain, stimulating both well, mostly stimulating neurogenesis, the growth of new brain cells. What are your thoughts on this puzzle, if you will?
Well, again, looking at everything from bacteria to humans, my conclusion was a ratio of about 80 to 20. 80% of the time in a semi-catabolic state, at least with overnight fasting, and 20% of the time really building up your muscles, neurogenesis, mitogenesis, making new mitochondria, improving your immune system. All these things need to be turned up as well. But if you think about most of us who have uh, ancestors from North America and Northern Europe, they went through 20,000 years of an ice age, only about 10,000 years ago. And, they had limited resources, and the body evolved to conserve and to take energy and put it into fat. And that was our long term resource to get through long, cold winters where nutrients weren't as available. And we're still living with that body in a time when nutrients aren't uh, in short supply. And one of the most important things is that people realize that as long as your glycogen stores are full, and I talk about this a lot in the book, you're never going to burn fat because the body is simply going to say, I don't know when I'm going to need this energy. I know that a famine is just around the corner because that's how we evolved. And therefore, I'm going to just store for that time period. But if you think about what humans were exposed to, um, they had one good season a year, summer and fall, sort of that mid point between summer and fall, where they could get a lot of protein and a lot of vegetables and berries, and everything was plentiful. And then they built up a little muscle and fat to make it through a pretty hard winter. So I think that keeping this sort of evolutionary history in mind helps us make right choices for ourselves. We can't go too long with autophagy being turned on and mTOR off, or we will start having fewer brain cells and stem cells and muscle cells, etc. But on the other hand, um, for a good part of the year, we don't want that to be the case because otherwise we'll risk higher and higher levels of cancer risk.
Hmm. Well, listen, thank you for your time today. It's a great book, and I will urge our viewers. Again, I got the manuscript one. I'm looking for my hard copy one of these days, hopefully. And great work, and I think the information is really, really valuable as people try to work their way through this and try to look at the value of the recommendations of the day of the so-called paleo diet, as if that were well defined, but more well defined would be getting into ketosis because we can measure that, ketogenic diet, et cetera. And what seems to be sort of trending right now is the notion of being on more of a carnivorous diet, eating much more protein, which I think, fair to say, correct me if I'm wrong, your book would argue against. Am I okay with that?
Generally so. I think there's some value to people who are grain sensitive, as you have pointed out. Green Brain is a great book, and a lot of people suffer from not being able to handle grains because it came fairly recent in our evolutionary history. And so a carnivore diet, in a sense, is an exclusion diet. If you go on an all meat diet, you're not eating a lot of rich carbohydrates that are going to cause, obesity and other issues. So anytime you're on a diet that loses weight and keeps you away from sugar and high glycemic breads and flour products, I think that's great. But it's not going to turn on autophagy the way we want. So there are ways that's discussed in the book to enjoy the benefits of both, and I think that's where we'll leave it for the carnivore people.
Yeah, ultimately people make up their own minds, but I think you've really added some very, very important information here so people can make a more informed decision as to what's best for them. So, or themselves, I guess. Thank you for joining us, and I hope we get a chance to see each other sometime.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, bye for now. So thank you, James Clement, for that really interesting information about the switch between anabolic activity and catabolic activity, the switch between breaking down and building up, and how important it is to consider not just building up, but the value of breaking down and getting rid of things that may well be defective. We know that accumulation, for example, of misfolded proteins is sort of a central theme in neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's. We know that excessive buildup of tissue may be what underlies things like cancer. So the idea of helping to break things down, I think, is extremely valuable. And how interesting it is that we have direct control over this pathway, this switch, the title of his book, but based upon our lifestyle choices as it relates primarily to our dietary choices, how and when we eat, as well as other things like the amount of exercise we get, etc. So again, here's the book. It is called The Switch, and trying to hold that so you don't get a reflection. James Clement was our guest today. Hope you enjoyed the program, and always want to thank you for listening and watching. I'm Dr. David Perlmutter. Bye for now.